and welcome to BrandSquare Live webinar featuring Blues Software's Stephen Kaufman, who will be covering 4 strategies to apply when your labeling can't fail. My name is Courtney Christ, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I would like to cover some housekeeping items. This webinar is interactive, so I encourage you to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the question chat panel on your screen. We will be monitoring the questions and will address them at the end of the presentation. We will also record this webinar for future viewing and will send out a link to the recording early next week. Please join in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag BrandSquare. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Stephen.
Hi, well, thank you for having me, Dave. Thank you for everybody who is taking the time out of their day to dial in. I'll try to make this session informative, and hopefully we'll get some questions at the end and make it interactive, as we said a little bit earlier. Moving on to the first section, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself. I have been working in the areas of packaging and labeling for the past 23 years, some of that in CPG, some in pharma, and some in the retail sectors. And I've been both on the production and pre-media side of that, as well as the workflow, asset management, and certainly the validation and regulatory compliance side. I have had the opportunity to speak at the PPLC, the Pharma Packaging and Labeling Committee, on several occasions. Was able to be awarded the Computer World Honor Laureate for innovation around our Blue product several years ago, and then I actually helped start Blue here in 1997. So we've been in business for almost 20 years. And lastly, I'm a board member of the ID Alliance. ID Alliance is a important organization for many of you. If you are interested in packaging, they recently merged with Epicom, and they really do quite a lot on color fidelity, color standards, workflow standards, metadata standards, et cetera. So if you haven't heard of them, that might be something good to check into or Google. So let's get into the meat of the presentation here. And talk about why labeling can't fail. I think some of these things seem a little on the obvious side, but I have customers ask us sometimes, do you guys really understand how important this is? Do you know what a big deal it is to our company if we wind up, even with an internal advice note, much less something more catastrophic like a product recall that it can literally affect the company's stock price overnight. In worst cases, it can mean that executives wind up in legal trouble, and then maybe as obvious also is just the cost. So I think it's important for me to represent that I understand the importance of these issues. They can't be more critical from these 3 areas, and I think the vendor space always needs to keep this in mind, particularly if they've been working in non-regulated environments. But I guess if you go beyond this, there's probably a deeper human issue at stake, particularly with pharmaceuticals for humans and animals. And that's the people taking these products, reading these labels, and using them, and relying very deeply on the information that we have presented to them as consumers before they ingest the pill or use the product. And so this is something that strikes home, me having 3 kids at home and all of us having families that we know rely on these products day in and day out. So in a certain sense, this is even more central to our mission. So what are these strategies we're going to talk about? How can we create processes around our labeling and packaging that don't fail because they can't fail? And then the economics, how can we take these strategies and make them work from an economic perspective? So I'm going to go over the 4 ways. The first way we'll talk about is installing problem detectors along the route, using technology and process to provide early warning if there are issues, both with time as well as quality. We want to look at our process and remove opportunities for error. And again, that can be a technical or a process approach. And then I'm going to talk a good bit today about the human elements, our organizations and the people that work at them, and the culture that we have to create around making our artwork and labeling right the first time. I'll talk a good bit about that. And then last but not least is safety net. If all else fails, what do we have going for us between the suppliers that we work with? We can have external designers and agencies, pre-media suppliers, as well as our in-house partners in manufacturing, and what can we put into place to give us a safety net if if we do run into a content error. So let's talk about the first one. Of course, you can't be passive with this topic, and I think your presence here today and you're spending this time in this webinar means that most of you aren't. But of course, the industry is changing very rapidly. I think particularly the integration of tools that we use in packaging and labeling get combined with other systems, and the industry is changing so fast we have to try to stay ahead of the curve if we're in this space. So let's talk about the problem detectors, and I'll get a little more concrete on that and give you some tactics. And at the end, I'll kind of summarize what I think are some of the most important tactics. So one thing to think about is how to proactively detect weak spots in the process and catch errors before they become problems. And we can do this by analyzing actually basic steps. So the first tactic I'll lift up is collecting and analyzing rejection reasons. So now most of us are using electronic tools to route artwork and labeling, and we're using it to move labeling between regulatory, folks in marketing, people that handle different aspects of the content on the package. And if you comment on a piece of artwork, you leave a note, and it might say, move this element to the left, or please double check this ingredient, or something like that. And then the artwork is rejected. You don't actually have a tangible way to go back and collect what the specific reason was. You have the artwork, you can go back to the artwork and read the comment, but it's hard to pull metrics from that. So one tactic is to, at the point of rejection, which is typically governed by 21 CFR Part 11, where there's actual electronic signature, you want to collect the reason for rejection very specifically in a category. So it might be a content inaccurate, used older version of artwork, or something like that. Typically 3, 4, maybe 5 at the most reasons, and then collect key performance indicators around those reasons and begin to correlate them. So do I always have certain same reason appearing on this product line, or is this common across product lines? Is it common to a geography or a particular kind of product? Does it happen more on my pills than it does on my liquids, etc.? And these rejection reasons and those correlations can lead you to creating an early warning system for your process. Also, rather than having to reactively run KPI reports, it's helpful to set up automated KPI reports that you might look at weekly or monthly, so there's a cadence to them, people understand what they are, and you can begin to drive your team's behavior with the results of the KPIs. KPI, key performance indicator, is an oft-used, maybe overused acronym. It really comes down to what you want to run your business. You're the one that determines what that key performance metric is, typically if you're managing a team, and then sometimes you've got KPIs upstream with the rest of your organization. Another tactic is relying on meaningful visual cues. So I think one thing I've seen change in the software market more recently is that when companies started building tools to manage this process, everybody kind of created their own iconography, their own meaning for visual cues. And what we're seeing more recently is many of us use Facebook or Google or other products on the internet all the time. So try to rely on cues that are accepted in the industry. These visual cues really will help your users need less training and get to the right spot quicker. Right kinds of notifications. So early on, a lot of tools would send emails out, but I think many of us are overwhelmed with the size of our email boxes. So I'm seeing more internal chats in products and focused emails that allow users to click on a link in the email and come right into the problem, rather than trying to do more atomic communication in email. It's great to attract somebody's attention. It's not great to have an ongoing complex conversation about a topic. Moving on into the next slide, let's talk about some gaps. So we don't want to leave gaps in the process. So maybe a typical gap, something that some of you might be able to identify with. If we spend a lot of time getting the right artwork printed on the right label, and that label roll or supply gets shipped to the manufacturer, at the very end of the process, the plant has to pick up the right label and verify that the label they're about to place on the product is the right label. So there are tools called scan to compare tools where they can scan the physical material and then compare it back with the final approved artwork and verify that the codes match, the component codes and the product codes match. And that would be an example of a gap that we often see between final artwork approval and plant manufacturing. So let's talk about removing some opportunities that we might have for error, and we'll go into some specific tactics there. So we don't want to be satisfied with these gaps I just mentioned. Some of the tactics in this area are working towards artwork automation. So I know I spoke at the PPLC a number of years ago, and one of the things that we pointed out was that a lot of the artwork is made by cutting and pasting text from approved Word documents and pasting them into Adobe Illustrator, where a lot of packaging artwork is created, or Adobe InDesign. And there are tools now that are beginning to take that text either from a Word document or straight out of a database of approved copy for packaging, and then move that through an XML structure directly onto a package. And this can be helpful for some, if not all, of the data on the package. It is a way to automate the construction of the artwork, at least to a degree, and creates one less step where there might be an error between the entry of the data and what was desired in terms of content. Another area about the process, and this starts to get into the people portion, is balancing global and local needs. So some of you on the phone might have a national product, and you don't worry so much with changes in global regulations across geographic markets, but I think many of you do. It's something that I hear our customers talk to us quite a lot. And the balance here is that locally, folks in that market, from the marketing standpoint or legal standpoint, might go, we're different, we have different regulations, a different process, and we need to work our way. And then globally, you're trying to have a harmonized process that everybody understands, and that when regulatory comes in and looks at the process, they don't have to remember the 19 processes that you have globally. Hopefully you can harmonize more towards one or two. But there's this tension between a global simplified process that is the norm in the company, and then a process that's flexible enough to handle nuances and changes in market. And I think typically we're seeing harmonized global processes create a balance that I would say is probably leaning 2/3 towards the global, but does still include the local component, so that local needs can be met and local markets feel that at least their concerns were addressed where they were absolutely critical to the process. Probably the last one here, and this comes back to cost and economics, is having a process where when people touch the artwork, the content, the die line, the design, that touch makes sense and adds value. So every time somebody touches artwork, it actually rings up a cost for the manufacturer of the product. And it's not that we don't want humans touching the process. We want to just design process that there's less pushing of paper and busy work, more automated tools, and that the touches actually are adding value, improving quality or improving communication across the team. So this slide just kind of points out that tension, and I guess in a good organization there's a healthy tension between those global concerns and local concerns. And then this graph is just representing a high value touch, that somebody is using knowledge and applying that knowledge into the product itself. So at the end of the day, as I said, we couldn't be passive. We can't procrastinate. We really have to move forward on this. I'm really seeing more aggression in the market towards adopting tools and maybe even re-adopting a second time to improve process further than the first time the tool was implemented. Let's kind of stay in this human element and talk about culture and fostering the right first-time culture. So I've seen a number of cases in my career where artwork's getting routed so often that people don't know really when the last time is. And so if I typically see an artwork 2 or 3 times and a new one comes to me, it's the first time and I'm extremely busy, I might think, well, you know what, this is probably going to come back around again. Legal's after me or so-and-so's after me, and it's sure to come through again. So I'm just going to give it a quick look. I don't think critical and go. And so we sort of have lost an opportunity in 2 ways. One, that's not a high-value touch. That's just a push-to-paper touch. And number 2, it's possible that in that instance, that artwork might not come around again. So the more we get right first time, the more people are tuned to, I might see this one and only one time, and so I'm going to make sure that my sign-off and my touch is highly accurate and it's valuable to the content. So reduce the number of expected rounds of review, as I just said. Enhance comment visibility. So when team members can see each other's comments, we think it enhances visibility and accountability to the product. It heightens it, and it creates a team culture around the artwork, and everybody's working towards making sure that it's right. Sometimes we have workflows where maybe only a manager sees team's comments, and they don't see each other's comments. I don't know that that's the best practice. I think teams can actually apply positive pressure to each other if there's something late or somebody's being a little sloppier than the rest of the team. There are subtle pressures that work culturally on teams that can be very helpful. Then kind of moving on to some of the small errors that can occur in a pharmaceutical, the difference between 10 and 1.0, if you think about that small period, is critical, and as we said earlier, it could even be life-threatening. So let's talk about some strategies to use safety nets in our process as we go through. So we know that everybody doesn't work at 100% of their peak capability and peak capacity day in, day out. We know that, myself included, every one of us has a day where we might be distracted by a personal issue, or we just simply are not engaged that day. And so some of these tools are in processes that you guys have implemented really are to gather around and make sure that we have coverage for that. So some of the specific tactics might be starting a piece of art with the latest approved version. In the pre-media industry, we always call this a pickup. And the pickup can be exceptionally valuable because instead of starting from scratch, I'm starting from something that's already been routed, already been approved, already made to market, already had all the right eyes set upon it. And so in that way, with this tactic, we can basically have a closed loop. So when you start a process, you go to your asset library, you pick up that last approved version, you bring it into your new workflow. Ideally, you'd be able to go into that last approved version and even see how many rounds it had, what the comments were on it, maybe pick up some learning or some artifacting from the last time that particular piece of artwork came through, and then you're kind of creating a fresh start. One thing to be careful with in picking up approved versions is not necessarily picking up all of the data that came with it. So, for example, if the change on a project is going to cause a change in a barcode or UPC or a QR code, and you're picking up that QR code from the last approved version, that can actually be a place where an error can enter the process. So typically you want to be smart about what's kept and what gets wiped out when you pick up approved artwork from a prior version. Another tactic here is to use 2 kinds of comparator tools. So there's 2 classes of these tools. There's a class called a graphics compare tool that basically takes the artwork and pixelates it and then presents the user with a pixel-by-pixel comparison of every spot on the package or label and notifies them, or actually may flash the error to the end user so they can see exactly where the change has been made. And this is helpful for a particular kind of error when we're making a very small change in a focus area of the package, let's say physically on the bottom right corner of the package. And in the graphic arts process, somehow something's changed on the upper left. Our eyes tend, and even in QC, we tend to gravitate towards the area where we know the change was requested. And this graphics compare creates a safety net and shows you exactly what's different from both the last approved version or cycle to cycle to cycle. If you're revising an artwork, it's getting rejected and then eventually approved, and you want to compare version 5 to 4, 4 to 3, 5 to 1, so on and so forth. The text compare is actually quite different. The text compare tool can take a source document like a Word document and compare it to a document in extreme different formats. So let's say an approved PDF artwork file or an Adobe Illustrator file. And so it's actually looking at the text, actually capturing the ASCII characters one by one in the source document and comparing it with the same data on the artwork that's being routed. So if you think about maybe a drug facts panel, and you've got the drug facts in Word, you've got all the percentages and all the information, these tools can actually intelligently find that same information on the packaging artwork and tell you if there's something as minor as a comma or period or shift in case. And then some of the better tools will tell you something's been bolded that wasn't bolded before, hyphenated that wasn't hyphenated before, so on and so forth. So it's more of a content-oriented compare than a graphics compare. And ideally, these two are working together, so you can do a text compare, you can do graphics compare, and you can get a single audit trail of every single deviation, both in text and graphic, so you have a nice clean audit trail and a clean activity path if there are deviations, how to clean them up and then make sure those deviations are captured appropriately. Last but not least, I kind of mentioned it before when we're talking about gaps in the process, there are tools that will then scan a physical printed sample of the approved art and then compare it back with the digital sample and give you a third safety net there. Each of these tools has a cost, and of course there is some time spent in deploying them. So it's very important to create an efficient process that binds these together in a clean way, hopefully in a single system so that users are not bouncing into one system and out of another. So I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to kind of have some takeaway thoughts, and then we're going to have a few minutes for some questions. So we talked about these 4 areas, installing the problem detectors, analyzing our workflow and removing opportunities for error, building right first-time culture, and creating the idea that end users looking at products might not see them again. And then we ended with the safety nets and ways to use automated tools to create these safety nets. So some takeaway thoughts here. I'll walk through a few of them, and like I said, I'll leave some time for questions. So high touches we talked about. Actually, the way I think of a lot of project planners in packaging and labeling is literally as choreographers. If you think about some of the complexities that you deal with every day, you might have 44 packages coming in because there's a manufacturing statement change. You have then a different order with 22 changes. But then unless you choreograph, you may find out that 7 of the 22 are actually on the other change, and you don't want to push artwork through with one change and then immediately push it through with another. So there's this idea of all these products essentially dancing around, and the goal of your team and your tool is to monitor and maintain that and bring some sense, some visibility and viability to that process, sort of take it out of chaos and turn it into something that can be managed. So really important here in choreography is picking tools that are flexible, because things always change. You start out, you might be working on 19 labels. In the middle of the project 3, you find out you're not going to revise them and you need to be able to delete them out, and then suddenly 2 more arrive and they need to be ejected, all while the entire overarching project is in flight. And so very important to have a tool that lets you insert, bypass, delete, and notify your team as those changes are occurring. Picking tools with vendors that have experience in implementing these new processes, and my belief is that this vendor space needs as much passion as it does knowledge, because there are a lot of very important issues to work through, and some are really a challenge. We talked about harmonizing in other words, global and local processes together, and why that's important. I think in an organization where you're changing process, you want to look for change champions. And often in my experience, that change champion is not necessarily the head of a department. There's just a typical human characteristics around people that can foster change in an organization, with peers, with people that work above them, with people below. And I believe it's an important process to try to identify who those change agents are, and then utilize their skills in changing and get them informed and get them informing others about changes that we want to make. think FDR said we have nothing to fear but change itself. I might have the quote slightly wrong, but there is a natural human element of fear when it comes to change and leaving what we know, particularly when there's such high stakes on the line with content. We don't want to ignore the politics of our organization, of our vendors, and the people in our departments. My experience is the best idea doesn't actually always win. It's the idea that's presented the best in maybe a meaningful way, a passionate way. So that's important to remember as well. Check the clock here. So I've just got another couple moments. I'm not going to walk through all these because I want to leave a chance for some questions. I'll put them up on the screen here. So if I see a question, I'll just stop. But right now, I'll walk through these thoughts to take away. Work with regulatory to allow for a learning process. This one I don't see talked about as much. Typically, when we set out and build a process and we don't involve regulatory early on, and then we change the process over and over, that can be looked at from a negative perspective by regulatory. But if we set up our process and we're complying with CGMP, and CGMP is actually telling us to build a process that comes with the best outcome. So as opposed to ISO, which is a manufacturing standard, which just says, say what you're going to do it, and then be able to document that you did what you said you were going to do. CGMP is actually more pushing you towards having the best outcome. And as such, there can be experimentation allowed in process as long as you say up front what the experimentation is, what the bounds of that experiment are, when you'll stop experimenting, and what your desired outcome is. So by that, I mean maybe you run two processes. Maybe you have an A process and a B process. You see which one's the most efficient, and then you have a very specific set of criteria for which you picked and why you picked it. And that's actually very much in keeping with the spirit behind CGMP. The same type of process could be presented. We're just flipping A, B, A, B, A, B. It looks very chaotic and uncontrolled and would be looked at more negatively by regulatory. Be smart about managing your profiles or die lines. Some people call them key lines. So the key line is really the basis for everything that we're doing on the art, both the design and the content. Smart about versioning, recognizing that a great label is just not a version of a great label. It's really a version of a mixture of the three kinds of content that I talked about a moment before. So you have die lines or profiles that change and are versioned, but they change more on the rare side because that impacts the plant. Then design changes happen more often than die line changes, but not as often as content changes. And it's really the careful blending of these three together that creates the version of a great package with perfect content that can easily slide through our processes and give us what we asked for in the beginning, which is accurate data for our consumers. So I'm kind of at the back end now. I don't see a question yet. So I don't know if maybe I'll go to my last slide here, and if a question slips in, I'll hit it. So this was just a really brief, quick walkthrough of some of the things that we've learned at Blue Software. We do have some knowledge guides and white papers on bluesoftware.com. Where you can learn more about the topics that I mentioned and other topics, best practices, and lessons learned in pharmas, and also questions that others have had. I do see one question coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and answer that. The question is, what do you recommend regarding managing design for labeling, an in-house team or hiring third-party agencies to do the work? Well, let's see. That's an interesting question. So I've seen that actually work both ways. So I've seen in-house groups that have tightly coupled communications. They know the folks. They're essentially on the inside of the organization. I think partly that's a question of scale because if you have a fixed-size team and typically in-house, the work hours might be, about 9 to 5, but they're not around-the-clock work hours typically on site in a pharmaceutical. So if you have big swings where you might suddenly have 50, 100 SKUs, 200 arrive and have to be worked on by the in-house team, that might present a scaling challenge. And then the external agency, of course, if you did select one, they need to be well versed in all of your regulatory concerns, and you need to feel level of comfort. And I've also seen hybrid models where a small in-house team might pick up a certain set of changes or might work on certain types of work, and then when work overflows, they have already a set up process and a partner in the space to let overflow bleed into. All right, I'm looking, and we're at the end of the session, and I thank you guys for the questions. I hope this has been helpful. I hope there's a couple of nuggets there for the expert, as well as some guideposts for people who might just be getting into this complex task of creating perfect labels. So thanks, everybody, and I'll go ahead and end the session now.